Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Atlas Core Fellows, scholars, and everyone who is attending this session on 3 different platforms. I'm welcoming you to the second keynote session of this Global Leadership Lab immersion on the theme of leading movements. We have folks from all over the world joining us on 3 different platforms, namely Hopin, YouTube, and Facebook. My name is Meredith Newmark, and I'm the Senior Program Director at Atlas Core, joining you from Washington, D.C., and I'm very excited to be on today's session as a moderator and have the pleasure to speak with our amazing guest. And this is our second Global Leadership Lab immersion this year, and I've already learned so much from our speakers. It's a boost for all of our leadership journeys, and I'm excited to share it with you. Before we kick off, here's a quick reminder. Our Atlas Core team will be monitoring the questions on each of our platforms, so please use that as a chance to ask questions of our speaker, post comments, etc. And to make things easier, start your comment with the letter Q, say where you're from, and then ask your question. And we'll get back to it at the end of today's event. To warm us up, all up a little bit, here is an icebreaker question for everyone. If you were to pick one superpower to have for 1 year, what would it be? Love to hear what superpowers you all want to have, and you let us know your responses in the comments section. And in the meantime, let me introduce today's guest. Our guest for today is Karen Volker. A little bit about her. Karen Volker is the Vice President of Strategy and Partnerships at Cure Violence Global, CVG, an international NGO that uses a health approach to interrupt and stop the spread of violence. Karen plays a key role in strategic planning, developing strategic partnerships, and pursuing opportunities to expand the Cure Violence global footprint, with an emphasis on expanding CVG's work in the Middle East. Karen, it is a big pleasure to invite you to today's session. As someone who works with rising leaders every day, we're so excited to have you. And I'm very excited about the experiences you'll share with us today. So Karen, welcome. And for the next 40 minutes, I'll be asking you some questions. And then the last 20 minutes, we'll take questions from the audience. And so I think it's a great time to come back to this icebreaker about superpowers. I think a great way to start the session would be to ask you if there's a superpower you would love to have.
Wow. Well, first of all, let me just say what a great pleasure it is to be with you all today. I'm a huge fan of the Atlas Core, and so I was very pleased when you asked me to participate in your Global Leadership Lab. I think the superpower that I would like would be the ability to make everybody have compassion and empathy for everybody else.
Oh, that's a good one. That would make such a difference in our world if we had that.
Yeah, I really think so.
Fantastic. Also, next, I'd like to hear a little bit about your professional journey. How did you first get involved with the field of violence prevention?
So I guess it's kind of always been in the background. I joined the State Department right out of graduate school and always sought opportunities to try to help people in some way. So while I was in the diplomatic corps, what really interested me and made me feel like I was contributing was when I felt like I was having an impact on the ground. So I sort of found a way to focus on promoting democracy or pluralism or human rights. And I know we're going to come back to this later, but I think there's a relationship there. And violence is always in the background in places where you don't have those things. And so I think that's kind of just been lurking. And then I guess later on, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got to Cure Violence.
Mm-hmm. Great, fantastic. And how is violence understood in the work you do? Or is there a particular definition that you guys use for violence or anything like that?
So, I mean, we are a health-based organization. Our roots are in the World Health Organization, basically because our founder is an epidemiologist who used to work at WHO. And so a natural place to look would be at the WHO definition of violence, which includes I don't have it memorized, but it's all forms of violence, including structural violence. However, I would say that our approach for interrupting and stopping violence is probably not applicable to every single form of violence, but it's applicable to lots of forms of violence.
Okay, great. And on the website of Cure Violence, we can read that violence is like an epidemic disease, and it can be effectively prevented using health methods, which is what you were just saying about the World Health Organization. What does it mean to use a health approach to interrupt and stop the spread of violence?
Right. So we view violence as a behavior that can be prevented and which acts or spreads like a contagious disease. So let me break that down a little bit. So first of all, it's a behavior, right? It's not about bad people. It's about a bad behavior. And when you think of it in that way, it opens up a new way of dealing with it. And we also know that it's contagious. It spreads from person to person. And this isn't just something that Cure Violence thinks. It's been proven through multiple studies that there was a workshop at the Institute of Medicine in 2013 where 2-day workshop where scientists from all over the world presented their findings on studies that they had done on how violence is contagious and all the different ways it is contagious. It's contagious between types of violence. It's contagious between people. It's intergenerational. It's this study, if you're interested, you can download the summary of it. It's available on the Institute of Medicine website. It's fascinating. So this idea that violence spreads like a contagious disease and understanding it that way opens up a whole new approach, which is based on the same approach that the World Health Organization uses to interrupt and stop the spread of a contagious disease. So it has 3 main components: detect and interrupt, change the behavior of the highest risk, and change the norms. So if I can, I'll just sort of briefly see what that means, right?
Yeah,
so
please do.
So detect and interrupt basically is trying to stop it before it happens. And the way to do that is to use credible messengers, people who are specifically credible with the people that you're trying to reach. So if you were a health worker, you were trying to get people to let's say breastfeed, you would have other mothers talking to those new mothers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you were trying to get sex workers to use condoms in order to stop the spread of AIDS, you would have sex workers talk to those sex workers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we apply that same principle and we focus on the people we're trying to reach, which are people who are doing the violence or at highest risk for doing the violence. And we figure out who are the people that they will listen to. So one of the things to know is that about behaviors is that up to the age of 10 or 12, behaviors are acquired through copying and imitation. But after the age of 10 or 12, it's really more about peer pressure. It's what your friends think or what you think your friends think, right, that you should do. So trying to reach those people and change those behaviors involves finding the people who they trust and who they view as credible. So we at Cure Violence then work with these individuals that are credible messengers. We don't do this work ourselves. We find local partners every place that we go, and those local partners are able to identify, hire, and manage the people who are credible messengers who can reach the people who are doing the violence. They then use their relationships and their knowledge of what's going on in the community to interrupt and stop conflicts from turning to violence. Right? So that's detect and interrupt. You're really getting ahead of it. You can make a huge difference by stopping violence before it happens because of the contagious nature of violence. When violence doesn't happen, it doesn't spread, right? So that makes sense. So then that's the first part, detect and interrupt. It's a very important part of this health approach. The second part is change the behavior of the highest risk. So this looks at people who are not yet doing violence, but are at high risk for doing violence. And here I'll emphasize it's really the people at the highest risk. If you have a group of 10 kids on the block and you pull over, you can, if you're the right worker, you would be able to dismiss basically 7 of them because they're not the leaders. And you would pull the 3 aside that are really the leaders and work with those 3. So you're really focusing on the highest of the high risk, not everybody who falls into a high risk category, right? And what you're doing with that is you're trying to change their thinking about the acceptability of using violence, right? So you're focusing on the mindset and that accepting that violence is an okay behavior, right? And then you're also recognizing that there are a lot of push factors and pull factors that might be influencing this behavior. And so if you know them well enough, which if you have the right workers, they would, then they can help to connect these individuals up with the services that they might need to then alleviate those push factors and pull factors that might be leading them more to a life of violence. Does that make sense? So detect and interrupt, change the behavior of the highest risk. The workers, you can call them anything. We have names. We call them violence interrupters for the first category and outreach workers for the second category. That second category is more like might feel or look to you more like a mentor or a social worker. You know, they carry a caseload, they have people that they follow up with on a regular basis, etc. The first group are more present in the street or where the violence is happening at the times when it's most likely to happen. So it's not like a 9 to 5 job. It's really targeted toward the time period when the violence is happening on the street, right? So that's detect, interrupt, change the behavior of the highest risk. The third component recognizes that violence happens in a context in which it's become normal. So in these communities where you have high levels of violence, whether it's a neighborhood, it could be a country at this point in some places, it's become normal to use violence to address grievances. People don't question it anymore. And so what we focus on in this component is really trying to change the norms as they relate to violence, change people's thinking about the acceptability of using violence. And again, using credible messengers, people who people will listen to. So you can't be an outsider and go in and say it and expect people to change their behavior. So it's really understanding the dynamics, understanding the context, and then finding the right people to be those messengers to change those things. So that's kind of in a nutshell. I'm happy to answer more questions about it.
Yeah, that is fascinating. As a follow-up question, how do you guys find and recruit the trusted people in the community and get them on your side? Because even that can be tough to build trust with them, given how important these messengers are. How do you guys do that?
Right. Well, the first thing is we don't do it. So there's two critical elements of success in this approach. One is having the right local partner, and the other one is having the right workers. The only way to have the right workers is if you've already found the right local partner. So when we do an assessment for this type of a program, that's one of the first you seek to understand the context in which the violence is happening, right? Really fully understand all of the dynamics. How many groups, how many cliques, how many crews, what are the push factors and pull factors, you know, who's involved. And then once you really understand, and where is it clustering? Like, it doesn't happen everywhere. It happens in very specific places. So where are those clusters? Then you find out what organization or individual has the ability to work in those places, who has credibility in those neighborhoods and can identify, hire, and manage the right workers. Only with the right local partner can you have the right workers. So we don't at Cure Violence pretend that we know that or we can do that. The second thing I'll say that's really important is nobody can make somebody else do this work. So the trick is finding the people who are already there. They're already there, either really already mediating conflicts in that neighborhood and people know about it and then they like know that they could do that, or they know that they're there like in their head, but they don't yet know how to do it. Like, right, they know them well enough to know they could be a candidate and then they can get trained. So what Cure Violence does is we're like a guiding and leading organization. Now that we've tested this model for 20 years, we know how it works. We've tweaked it, we've adapted it multiple times. So now we guide and train in the implementation of this approach, and we can train in the management of the program, and we also train the workers. Our workers are able to but able to determine whether or not someone who's been selected to be a worker really is the right worker just through questioning them, because they've had a lot of experience. So our team will often help verify that someone that local organization thinks is the right worker actually is the right worker just through sort of that interview process. I call it the dog sniff test. It's not meant to be a bad thing, but like these guys and gals, they know when someone's blowing smoke, they know if they're telling the truth or not, and they can tell whether they have the right relationships. So Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting that so much of being at the forefront of this movement is actually just connecting people to each other, not even having, more of a guide on the side, than being sort of telling people what to do.
I think it's the first thing about leading a movement is not actually doing it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And what's also interesting about Cure Violence is that it's a global organization that doesn't just operate in the United States, but also other countries such as Colombia or Trinidad and Tobago. In your experience, how is the work towards violence prevention similar or different in these countries?
So it's adapted everywhere we go. Whether it's in another city in the United States or in another country, it's adapted in multiple ways, and that adaptation happens in partnership with the local partners. So we don't adapt it before we go. It's done jointly with that local partner organization. As we learn more about the context in which violence is happening in that specific neighborhood, we work with them to figure out, okay, what's the adaptation? We stick to the same principles, but there are times when you may not implement. We view it as a whole package, right? But maybe there's a context in which you can't do detect and interrupt, change the behavior, the highest risk, and change the norms all at the same time from the very beginning, right? Let me give you an example because it's counterintuitive. So when we first went into Honduras, it was crazy levels of violence. This was back in 2012, I think, 12 or 13. And we went in there, took 3 assessment visits before we found the right local partner who actually could go into the communities where we were in San Pedro Sula, where you had the highest levels of violence. And that's also one of the things that we do as an epidemic control model. We go to where you have the highest concentration of the problem. You don't start in the easy places. So there we were, about third assessment visit. There's like crazy amounts of violence, 35 different kinds of violence going on all the time. And we found this one woman who was able to be our local partner. She had credibility in those communities, and she had relationships unusually with both MS 13 and 18th Street. So she was able to help us reach those people. But we couldn't have them on the same team. So we set up 2 separate teams. We met with them separately. It's like shuttle diplomacy, but with violence training, right? And then we went through with them, what are the main things the reasons that people do violence? And they came up with their list. And there's a lot of the same reasons, and it's stupid reasons, honestly. It's not like a great justification, like somebody wore the wrong color or put their hat to the wrong side or, looked at their girl or whatever. Like, it's just stuff like that triggers this violence because it's just how they're used to dealing with any issue that they have a problem with, right? So I would have thought, this is me being new at the time, that the first thing we would do is start with norm change, right? We'll talk about not doing violence, right? That's the easy thing. But it was the opposite. If you talked about not doing violence, you would become potentially a victim, like you would get shot. So the behavior change and the norm change were actually held off. And we started just with interruption. And we didn't start with trying to interrupt everything. We agreed on specific. So this is like confidence building measures. They agreed on certain reasons why they wouldn't kill each other for that next week, right? This sounds stupid, but it's the beginning, right? So my colleague Lupe, who leads our Latin America program, she called, baby steps. So for the next week, they both agreed not to kill each other for these 5 reasons, all right? So, and then that week went by, nobody did. They added more. 2 years later, a year and a half later, they're actually having a peace soccer match, with both teams playing, and families were visiting each other across the invisible lines for the first time in over a decade. So, I mean, but you have to know how to do it. You have to go slowly. Another quick example in Iraq, when we first started in Iraq, it was the end of the war. And that if you reported a dead body, you could be killed for reporting a dead body. So it was another case where I would have thought you'd start with like PubEd or something, but they started instead with like we started like even way back with just like barely training on the model, right? And not even trying to do interruption until we got to the point where then people who were trained in the model were able to then use it in very select circumstances, but not really publicly, right? So every place it can be very, very different. The same principles apply.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah. Although like you can have results almost immediately. So it's a marathon in that, like depending on the circumstance, it may take a while to get to where you want, but you also it can go very fast depending on the the neighborhood or what's happening. Like so, yeah, it's both.
Great. And when it comes to this strategy of curing violence, what would you say are the biggest challenges or obstacles that get in your way, either in the United States or other countries, and how do you address some of those obstacles?
So one of the obstacles that is something I alluded to before, which is that people accept a certain level of violence as being normal and okay. And so that really gets in the way of actually stopping violence. Like even organizations that say that they work in the field of violence prevention, they provide treatment to people who've been, victims of violence. It's like, what? Like, like violence is okay. You're going to just like help the victims. No, let's like not do the violence. Right. So I think we need a real mental mind shift, which is the second thing, which is the wrong paradigm. So people think about violence as being about bad people. And so all of the answers, all of the programs fall into this stream of rule of law and justice and criminal justice type programs. And so it just sort of takes you down this path of like punishing people after they've already done violence, and still again not really getting them not to do violence, right? Or threatening them with violence. That's so like backwards, in order to get them not to do violence, right? So we think that the wrong paradigm and just like the general overall acceptance of violence are two big things that perpetuate violence in the world.
Interesting. And as Vice President for Strategy and Partnerships, you often have to interact with donors, policymakers, and other NGOs. What are the most important things to keep in mind when you're building relationships and partnerships like these?
I would say the first thing is there's got to be a mutual benefit. So you need to really think about what works. Why is this important and good for both of your organizations, or both sides, right? The second thing is you have to have a vision for what that partnership is for. A partnership for the sake of partnership doesn't really mean very much, right? So why are you having the partnership? You need a reason and a clear vision for that. And then if it's something that you really want, a partnership that you think is important, then persistence. You need to stay with it in order to build that partnership. And sometimes it takes a long time. You can plant a seed for a partnership, and it might be 4 or 5 years before it actually sort of turns into something that's like a thriving partnership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. It's building that relationship. And our training this week focuses on the theme of leading movements. And what does leadership mean to you? And what have you learned about leading movements throughout your career?
So I think most of my knowledge about leading movements has probably come from Cure Violence, but a little bit at the State Department, right? And I think the biggest factor is having a vision that becomes a shared vision, right? It's not just a single person's vision, but it's a vision that's a shared vision. And then this maybe it makes sense to people, or maybe it's intuitive, but perhaps not an infrastructure. So a movement doesn't just happen. And then in order to, so you need an infrastructure. And then the third thing is it's periodic injections of energy, right? So it's not one big push. You have the infrastructure in place, and then you inject it with energy at critical moments in order to keep moving it forward. That's kind of what I've learned from reading and talking to other people.
Yeah, those are great insights. Thank you. And now let's talk a little bit about your own leadership journey on a personal level. Before your position in Cure Violence, you worked for over 25 years in the U.S. Foreign Service. What were the lessons you learned during your time here? And tell us a little bit about sort of what brought you to Cure Violence over the course of your career.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the lessons I learned at the State Department. Well, it's interesting. One is that, sometimes you have to keep your mouth shut, because in the State Department, your job is to represent the State Department and our policy. And so you have to know your role. And if you disagree with the policy, there are channels for speaking your mind and trying to change policy, right? And just like really understanding how the system works and working within the system is one thing. Although, I think that could also backfire on you. Like you can also limit yourself too much and allow yourself to be too limited by bureaucracy. So I think that I've sort of saw both, and I think I may have myself allowed myself to be too controlled by the bureaucracy. And then when I left the State Department, it was a big relief to sort of all of a sudden have my own opinion about things, feel like I for the first time in my adult life, so that's not a lesson, but I guess it's just sort of like a feeling that I had when I left the State Department. In terms of how I came to know Cure Violence, when I was working on countering violent extremism at the State Department, I was working for Karen Hughes, and Gary Slutkin, who's the founder of Cure Violence, had talked to Laura Bush, who was obviously, she was the first lady at the time, about how he thought their program could be adapted and applied in Iraq. And so Laura asked Karen to have someone meet with this guy and talk to him, and that someone was me. And so I met with him and I thought, this is interesting. And I was always open to new ideas. And at that point, so I worked with him to adapt the model to apply in Iraq in 2008, toward the end of the war. And we just stayed in touch. And then when he found out I was leaving the State Department, he offered me a job. And then here I am. But I feel like I didn't really answer your question about lessons at the State Department. So
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Well, that it was interesting that you said there was like a balance in having to deal with sort of bureaucracy and having to navigate that. Have you applied those lessons maybe in your current work, or are there other lessons from the State Department that you're applying at Cure Violence maybe?
Oh, I think there's lots of stuff that I definitely am able to apply in terms of things that I learned, even just out how to move things forward or run meetings or communicate with other people or something like that. In terms of, and also just my own awareness of how maybe I didn't sort of maybe push hard enough sometimes has now led me to maybe stand up and push harder now. So I think I learned that lesson through that way, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I'm more willing to push against the grain and explore, why we're not doing something a certain way if I think we should be doing something a certain way. Great.
Yeah, questioning those that conventional wisdom. And you've devoted your professional life to promoting pluralism and democracy, defending human rights, and preventing violence. How do you see these issues as connected, in your opinion, or how do these issues affect one another?
Mm-hmm. So pluralism and human rights, I think both of them, all of them, I think democracy is kind of a system, right? But with pluralism, it's about accepting other people and sort of celebrating differences and accepting differences. And when you don't have pluralism and you see people as other, you have a higher potential for violence. And I think similarly with human rights, when people's human rights are not, if people cannot exercise their human rights, then there's also the more potential for violence. And I think that even just prohibiting someone to exercise their human rights is a form of violence, right, in certain ways. So I think there's a connection there. It's just one of the issues that to me personally has always been important. And so I'm just glad that now I have the opportunity to work on it.
Yeah, that's so true. Um, and then our last question before we get into the audience Q&A part, if you were to give 3 pieces of advice for all rising global leaders watching us right now, what would they be?
Yeah, so I was excited to see this question because it made me think about it as well. And I kept coming up with more than 3, but I boiled it down to 3, I think, solid ones that I think. First is you have to have passion for whatever it is you are doing and follow your passion. And the second one is don't wait for permission to be a leader or to lead on something, and don't ask for permission, or and don't wait for someone to ask you, right?
Mhm.
If it's something that you're passionate about and you want to do, then you should find a way to do it, right? I think I spent a lot of my life waiting for permission to do things. And so just really don't want other people to do that. And then the third thing is don't limit your thinking to what you already know. So there are um, two sayings that I picked up when I was about the age of a lot of your Atlas Corps fellows, maybe a little bit younger when I was a junior in college. And I've carried them with me sort of for my whole adult life. And they sort of guide my thinking. And it relates to this last point about not limiting yourself. So the one saying is, free are those who are not afraid to reach the end of their thoughts. It's much better in Spanish. But so, and the second one is the ideals are like the stars. You never reach them, but they guide your path. And both of those, I think, are really powerful reminders of not limiting your thinking, and not being afraid to like go further than what you think is possible.
Mm. Those are beautiful inspirations. I was wondering when you mentioned this idea of like trying not to limit yourself, not waiting for permission. Is there something that sparked this change in you of wanting to be more, push a little bit harder, or do you think that was just kind of the experience of the journey of a career?
Well, I think that it's just something that maybe I experienced more than other people in terms of self-limiting, and I don't know where it came from. And so it's just something I'm aware of with myself, and I think other people don't necessarily feel it as much, and it's not as big of an issue. So if it's something that resonates with you, if you feel like, yeah, oh wait, I do that, then try not to do it. It's really, you have so much more to offer, and you should not be limiting yourself, and you should not let other people limit you.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that note, let's see what questions are coming in from our audience members. Our first question is from one of our Palestinian Atlas Corps fellows. Have you had experience of choosing a local partner who later turned corrupt or was a bad choice from the beginning? And how do you handle a situation like that?
Yeah, so actually, not one that's turned corrupt, but we did have, this was one of our earliest lessons learned. We did select a local partner who claimed to be local, like claimed to have the right relationships, but they weren't actually based in, this was, I won't say the country, but they weren't based in the country. It was very early on in our international experience. I was not at Cure Violence at the time, but we learned that they didn't actually have the relationships that they claimed to have. And they couldn't even get our team into the country with the right visas and stuff ultimately. And so that's when we were like, okay, no, we really need like a real local partner, not just someone who's from there who claims to have local ties. And so but we haven't actually, I think it's partly due to our due diligence and our assessment process. We haven't had a partner that's been corrupt and that we've had to walk away from, as far as I know. I mean, my colleague might correct me, but as far as I know, that's the case.
Yeah, well, good work on that. Another question from Jonas in Ethiopia. What is one thing that our young leaders can do to bring about peace, and what knowledge or skill set should future leaders have to minimize violence?
So I think one thing that all of you guys as leaders can do is to speak out about not doing violence, to use your own voices, not accept violence as being like something that you have to accept, like that we can't do anything about. One of the things that drives me the most crazy is the early warning, quote unquote, early response, where the response is just wringing your hand saying, yeah, we knew that was going to happen. So let's like get beyond the wringing of the hands. And if we know something's going to happen, actually like try to prevent it from happening. Obviously, always taking care of your own safety. If you're not the right person, don't get involved. Don't think that you can do it, and don't think that you should do it just because it needs to be done. But find the right people who can actually like make it happen and make that use their influence to stop violence. In terms of a knowledge or skill to minimize violence, yeah, I don't know if there's a knowledge or skill that can do that. Unfortunately, yeah.
Right. Okay. Here's a question from Godfrey in Tanzania. How would you address the violence in a situation where there are groups benefiting it? Of course, we talked earlier how acceptable violence can be in some cases. What about when there's someone who's like profiting or benefiting off of that violence?
Yeah, so I'm going to break this into two categories. One is if they are benefiting from the violence, like for economic gain, say it's a gang and they make money off of selling drugs or something like that. What we do is we don't try to get them not to sell drugs, or we just really focus on the question of violence. So if you, what we found is if you isolate the violence and the behavior of violence from the other things, often you can get them not to use violence. There are other ways for them to achieve their goals. If you have the right workers, what we found, and this is a US example, I think it might be true also in Latin America, if you have the right workers, they have enough respect on the block that when they're on the block, people will voluntarily stop the other activity so that those guys aren't wrapped up in it or tied up in it. And then when they leave, they might go back to selling their drugs, but they have enough respect for the individuals who are the workers, the interrupters, to not do it while they're there. So, and then another example would be from Latin America. I mean, we've worked with cartels, we've worked with gangs, and they all have economic like motives, right? And they still were able to like stop the violence. Because if you talk to any of these people, they themselves don't want to get killed, and they don't want their families to be killed. Everybody has a reason to want to stay alive and want to like have people close to them not be killed. And when you can reach them and explain to them and get them to see it from that perspective, you can get them to change their own behavior and influence other people's behavior. I will say that in my mind, violent extremist organizations that have, if their reason for being is to use violence to achieve a political goal, I find it more difficult to think that you can stop the violence after someone's already joined that group. So I think our intervention point for countering violent extremism is more at the preventing radicalization and recruitment rather than at preventing violence after someone's already joined a group. That's just, I haven't yet seen my way through to thinking that we could use this approach to stopping violence once someone's already joined a violent extremist group. If someone else has a different opinion and can tell me how they think it can be done, I would love to hear from them.
Yeah, I'm sure that deprogramming someone who's been radicalized is very difficult, I'm sure. Marta from Lithuania asks, some types of violence are more straightforward or visible than others. And so how do you address violence that's more clandestine or when the perpetrator feels like their violence is justified, for example, in gender-based violence?
So I think that, well, we actually have been trained in Spotlight and Inspire methods, which are like some UNICEF programs for dealing with gender-based violence. And a lot of gender-based violence is supported by norms and expectations that say that it's normal and okay in those communities. And so we're able to break down some of these myths about male masculinity, and some of the cases that's what's driving it, and really talk to them. But again, it's not us talking to them, it's getting the right people to be making those same arguments and telling them, like, in their own language, it's not cool, to beat your wife or whatever, right? Like, they know the words to say, they know how to say it. I think the big thing with gender-based violence is actually putting it on the table and having people deal with it who have credibility with the people that are doing it. There's some really interesting examples of, and and like sort of using naming and shaming and calling people out in the area of gender-based violence. One is I don't know the country. There's a country in Africa. There's women who, if somebody's husband beats them, from what I understand, the women of that village would go and beat their hands outside the home of the man who did this, is a way of like shaming him, which I thought was brilliant, right? And then there's in India, I heard a story about Ring the Bell campaign. So if you hear something happening and you know that something's going on in the apartment next to you, you can go ring the bell, like the doorbell, and ask for like a cup of rice or whatever, and sugar, whatever, if you're baking, and interrupt the moment, right? That interruption can give the person time to like get away, or just break up whatever it is that's sort of the moment, and give a chance for that not to escalate to further violence, right? So you can think creatively about, is there a way to interrupt this? Is there a way to like change a norm? You know, it's so many ways this can be done. It's just really thinking about, how do you detect and interrupt? How do you change the behavior? How do you change the norms? And so you can do that in some of these ones that are more invisible. The one that I was thinking about this morning that I'm not sure we could do it with, but maybe we could through norm change, is structural violence. Like, you really then have to like change what people think is normal when you're dealing with structure. I think because it's hard to interrupt, right? You may be able to interrupt, but I don't know. But yeah, so I think, you just have to really kind of sit and think with it for a while and figure out what would be the right approach for that particular kind of violence.
Yeah, those strategies you shared are genius. Gael from Madagascar asks, is there a level of violence or forms of violence that you prioritize over others? With so many different types of violence around the world and so many different places where it occurs, how do you go about choosing what to deal with first?
Well, I mean, there's like you said, you could do this everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So we started with community violence in the United States, and so that's what we've done for the longest. We've done that for 20 years. Also in Latin America, that's the focus. We've incorporated in the last few years this gender-based violence into those efforts. We've kind of just like interwoven it into our trainings for now in the same communities. What we've seen through some of these studies is that where you have high levels of community violence, you also have higher levels of other kinds of violence, whether it's domestic violence or child abuse or et cetera. So it's important to bring down that community violence as a way of actually bringing down all the violence and lowering the pressure and the example that's being set in those communities. We respond to demand, I mean, like from communities, right? For the most part. Part of my job is looking for opportunities to apply that cure violence approach in other countries and in other contexts. And because I came from working at the State Department and came most recently from working on the Middle East, that's what I focused on. So I've done a lot of like thinking about that. And that's really, I wouldn't say we're prioritizing certain things over others. It's just where there was an opportunity or there's funding, honestly, But we did a 2-year program in Syria in the middle of the war, and not focused so much on stopping the war, but focused on helping people have greater security, less violence in their communities that wasn't coming from the war, right? So helping them see that there's a way that they could improve their own circumstances when the bombs weren't dropping, right? So there's always a way that you can figure out a way in for something. I think you just have to really think it through.
Sure. This question comes from Ephraim in Ethiopia. How do you see the role of psychological trauma healing in the health intervention that you conduct to stop violence?
Say that again.
Oh, sorry. How do you see the role of psychological trauma healing in this health intervention stopping violence?
So it's so, I'm really glad that you raised that, because everybody who experiences violence and everybody who witnesses violence experiences some form of trauma from that, right? And knowing that, I think, is really important. So it's we've got this term in the field, trauma-informed care, which I think is overused, and I'm not sure that anybody really fully knows exactly what it means. But the first thing is knowing that people have been impacted in a deep way when they've been exposed to violence, and understanding that can help people to react differently when they're interacting with people who have been exposed to violence or even grown up in a context where there's a lot of violence. And if everyone's more aware of that, then you can moderate your own reactions and behaviors, right? One of the things I've thought about is we've been working with police or military as they so help them see the people they're dealing with and understand that they've all been traumatized. And if they could understand that they themselves have been traumatized by the violence that they're witnessing every day and perpetrating and experiencing, right? Like everybody needs to understand it more. So I don't know that we have sufficiently at Cure Violence fully integrated this, like, trauma informed care and as much as we could or should. But I think it does definitely needs to happen.
Sure. Elena from Russia asks, do you have experience in working with violence in military forces, particularly people who have been at war? And what's the approach, the best approach there? And of course, Elena is also wondering, do you have a local partner in Russia?
We do not. I would love to find a local partner in Russia, so that's great. And in terms of working with military forces, what the thinking I've done on this has been more on working with disengaged combatants, like in a DDR context, so demobilized soldiers, recognizing that they have been living in a circumstance where using violence was like their way of like achieving whatever it was they were trying to achieve, right? Because they were members of some sort of military force or paramilitary force or what have you. So recognizing they're at higher risk for doing violence, I've thought about what's the design for a program that would help them. And again, you're partnering them up with people that they know and trust. People are going to change their thinking about the acceptability of using violence, right? People who are going to understand their needs and what are the push factors and pull factors that are particular to their situation to help them not revert to a life of violence or not use violence in their new environment when they're reintegrated into the community, right? So it's not the same as like working with violence across military forces, but I think that you can kind of adapt it from that same way of thinking. You can use some of those same adaptations probably for that.
Yeah, interesting. Pearl from Uganda asks, have you encountered a situation where the efforts of Cure Violence are reversed or can't continue due to some policy? And how do you deal with a challenge like that?
So yeah, well, mostly the reversal happens when the funding gets taken away. So a lot of this is related to the question of sustainability, and so it could possibly be a policy, but usually policies don't get in the way of our doing programs. But if we're funded and then funding gets taken away and the program gets pulled, we have seen an uptick in violence, right? The interruption can happen almost immediately and have an impact almost immediately. The longer term change is the behavior change and the norm change. That takes more time. So if the program is interrupted before those norm changes happen, then I think you have a higher possibility that when the funding goes away and the program is stopped, and the interrupters are taken off of the street because they're keeping things cool while you're also trying to change behaviors and norms. If you take the interrupters off the street and nobody's keeping things cool and those norms haven't yet changed, then it's normal that it would go back up, right? So but then in terms of a policy, I suppose if they implemented a policy that was like a heavy rule of law where the police and military came in and did their thing, right in the same place where you're trying to like do your program, I guess that would really prevent us from actually working in that place. That would be a policy that might like prevent us from doing our work. Yeah.
Sure. Well, this question gets back to more of your personal leadership journey that you shared earlier. Redempta from Kenya asks, what measures did you take to stand up or push hard for your voice to be heard, especially in high-level meetings and influencing policies or strategies?
Interesting. So this is maybe just something that's personal to me. When I'm in a meeting and I'm representing and I know what I know, I have no problem speaking my voice and saying what I'm saying. That's always been the case. like oddly, because before I'm in that meeting, maybe is when I'm more reserved and hesitant to use my voice and to say something. Or if I'm not in a position of authority, then maybe I won't be like, well, maybe it's not my role to say something. And so that's what I was encouraging people to, like, don't self-limit. If you see something that needs to be changed or questioned, then find a way to question it, and don't hold yourself back in the same way that I did when I was young in the Foreign Service, right? So I think that as I got older and more experienced, and I'm fortunate in that if I feel like I'm there and I have something to say, and I believe that what I have to say is correct, then I will have no problem actually saying it, even if it's counter to what everybody else is saying or doing. I'm not that easily persuaded or influenced not to say something when I know what I know and when I'm confident, right? So it's really just prior to that where maybe I'll hold myself back a little bit more.
All right. Do you ever encounter situations where you feel like the other person's maybe not listening to you, and what strategies do you use when someone's when you are speaking your voice, but you're not necessarily feeling heard?
So I think you got to know when to stop pushing in that particular meeting. That's not going to be your only choice, only opportunity. Like if you feel like your voice isn't being heard for whatever reason, maybe other people are talking, maybe you feel like they've already made up their mind, you need to sort of maybe go back and not retreat, but find another opportunity to, like, make that point or re-articulate it or what have you. It doesn't help to just keep pushing in the same meeting if you're not getting anywhere. You have to sort of really be able to read that situation and know when it's okay to keep pushing, and know when you need to, like, pull back and try a different tactic.
Yeah. True. Absolutely. To try a different method. All right. This will be our last question from Jonas. How do you see social media's negative contribution on instigating or propagating violence, especially group violence?
Absolutely. It's a huge problem. And I think that it affects violence in so many ways. So it can promote actual violence on the street within minutes. It can show violence, and therefore, through the contagious nature of violence, create more violence, right? So it just helps to spread this violence. It has made it easier for people to bully other people because they feel safer when they're not having to do it in person, right? So I think social media has had a huge negative impact on violence and spreading violence. And I'd love to see more and more social media efforts to change norms around violence and accepting violence, and figure out what are the ways that we can actually use positive messaging. It can sound so trite, right? So, but what are the real ways that we can maybe do more to change that using social media, since it is such a powerful tool? Use it for our positive benefit, not just the negative benefit.
Yes. I hope we can find a way. All right. Well, thanks so much. Those are all the questions we have for today. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today for another keynote session of the Atlas Corps Global Leadership Lab Immersion. And thank you to Karen for devoting your time to share your experiences with our audience. Make sure to follow us on Facebook and YouTube for more engaging content like this. Again, my name is Meredith, and our guest today was Karen Volker from Cure Violence Global. And we wish you and Cure Violence the best of luck addressing this very, very important issue. And I want to say thank you to everyone and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.